Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Janet, as well, for that introduction. So as Janet mentioned, I'm Britt Duffy-Adkins. I'm a space urban planner, which sounds really cool up until you realize that I'm probably one of the only people that decided to take that title, because it is a little bit out there. But actually, as I'm going to discuss today, it's really something that we need to be thinking about right away as we start to lay a foundation for what the future of lunar and Martian settlement will someday look like. So also, as Janet mentioned, Celestial Citizen is on a mission to build sustainable space communities by bringing together people, systems, and technology. And one of the really most important tenets of what we aim to accomplish is trying to encourage people to think about the future in a very radically different way. So it's starting to become obviously something that people are talking about more and more today. And actually, if you speak with people from indigenous communities, it's been something that has been inherent to their communities for a very, very long time. But better planning today enables greater options for tomorrow. And so really want to encourage the space industry and this community to be thinking generationally about how we go about solving challenges and problems in space and building out our future. So I'm going to talk about space urban planning today, but maybe let's start with if everyone could just raise their hands if you're familiar with urban planning on Earth. Okay, so we've got some people here, that's great to see. But since we're at a space conference, I'll give a little bit of context anyway. So urban planning is not only the physical design of the built environment, it's not only architecture and city design, but it is also thinking about the political, economic, and social institutions that underpin that community or city as well. So it is inherently a very multidisciplinary approach to the way that we think about living and working. And so space urban planning specifically is, in my opinion, a great way of maintaining continued channels of participation and high levels of civic engagement in what we're trying to build on the lunar surface and eventually on the Martian surface. Also, space urban planning can be an excellent tool for cross-industry collaboration. Too often, I see in this industry in particular, but also just industries generally, tend to not do a great job of speaking amongst each other. So I think there's a lot of conversations that are excellent and making a lot of progress, but they're operating primarily in silos. So hopefully with space urban planning, we'll be able to bring more and more people and industries together so that we can start to uncover not only what the gaps are, but also start to uncover what potential solutions are, seen from the perspective of someone who might have never thought that they would get involved in space, much like myself, if we go back enough years. So another piece of space urban planning is that we want to really encourage and establish a participatory framework. So I'm going to talk more in my presentation about this as well, but really public participation is a key element of this. We want every human on this planet to think of themselves as potentially a celestial citizen. So as not being a part of necessarily just their locality or their individual nation, but we want them to start thinking of themselves as a global citizen, and the next a celestial citizen, which is starting to think about the entire solar system as part of their environment and ecosystem. And some of the way that we can work towards doing this and also making people feel heard is to actually integrate the ideas and feedback that we receive into actionable institutional design and also eventually urban design for the lunar surface and eventually the Martian surface. And I know that that's the whole point of this conference here, is to talk about the moon as sort of that first step, and I think that's absolutely right. But I also think too often we can think about the moon as a little bit more of like a test bed or a place where we can make mistakes. But I will just point out that, as all of you know, doing anything in space is incredibly costly. But what would be the cost of undoing anything in space, right? So we need to start really thinking about the moon, yes, as maybe that first step to Mars, but also as a place where we want to go in as thoughtfully as possible. So space urban planning can also help us balance different stakeholder interests. So one of the key things that urban planners do is stakeholder analysis. So looking at all the different organizations, individuals, groups, entities, and starting to understand what their key priorities are and how we try to solve for, answering to and speaking to as many of those priorities as possible. You're not going to be able to please everyone, and it is a huge task to try to undergo an international planning process for space, but I think we can start somewhere and make a significant impact. It's also going to be about providing equitable access to digestible information. So within this industry, we do a great job of creating tremendous research. But how much of the general public actually consumes that? And so I think we need to be thinking also in our media strategies and approaches about starting to open that up and make it more digestible for people that maybe don't see themselves as part of the space community, or maybe are a little intimidated by it even, or perhaps neutral. Perhaps, they just don't really have an interest in it. How do we reach those people? And then how do we convince the people who think we shouldn't be going to space anyway? So these are all some of the problems that we try to solve at Celestial Citizen. And specifically with relation to some of the knowledge gaps that we'll be talking about here today, one of the key ones is balancing objectives. So what I mean by that is, when we go to the moon, how do we think about balancing scientific interests versus commercial interests versus cultural or heritage interests, et cetera? There's lots of different things that we'll need to consider, and how to balance those different priorities is going to be really important. Another thing that we're going to need to do is actually start to undergo, and this is obviously already underway, but we need to do a really rigorous job of looking at the surface, studying it, surveying the land. I think sometimes we lead a little bit too much with what we plan to do there before we necessarily even fully understand what is there. So a good friend of mine who is a lunar geophysicist talks about the fact that 1 meter below the lunar surface is luna obscura. And I love that phrase, because if we don't even really know or understand what is there on the lunar surface or just below it, then I'm not really sure how we're going to effectively build or decide where to build or what to build in any sort of way that seems efficient or productive. And then once we have a better understanding of the various resources, the lunar surface, eventually the Martian surface, we need to figure out how are we going to manage these? How are we going to share resources? How are we going to think about not creating a first come, first serve sort of mentality or a Wild West mentality on the lunar surface? So all of these things will be key to consider. Also, looking at sustainability and waste management. So, this is something we obviously have not tackled here on this planet. We still have a tremendous amount of work to do to clean up the mess we've made here. So how, and I guess what is our plan for the lunar surface where we don't even have the ability to, not saying this is a good thing to do, but to send our waste somewhere else where we can't see it, right? When we are truly confronted with our waste and with the consequences of our actions, how are we going to contend with that? And I really hope that we do it in a much better way than we've done here on Earth. Also, transportation networks. So once we start actually having people going to the lunar and Martian surfaces, once they start doing science there, living, working, eventually maybe we'll have commercial interests there. How do we start to think about getting people around in ways that are efficient and make sense? I traveled in from LA. LA is not really known for its transportation, right? So that's something that we really need to think about. Expansion planning. So often I hear of people talking about, well, we might have a base here and another base here, et cetera. But the interesting thing about that is if we don't have some sort of idea or framework going in for how we're going to handle expansion as more and more people are there, but also as more and more operations get set up, then we're going to have like lunar sprawl, which again, not to pick on LA, but I don't think anybody wants that. And so last on this list, but certainly not least, is zoning and land use planning. right? So this is a tricky concept too, because in the US there's actually a pretty terrible history with how zoning was used to really disenfranchise a lot of groups of people. So I think we need to be really careful in how we think about zoning and land use planning to make sure that we're doing so in a way that is hearing what the public wants, as well as what the science community wants, as well as commercial actors. We need to find some sort of harmony in the way that we all live and work together. Okay, so this is question time, all right? So I love this slide because, of course, I don't think I'd really be an urban planner if I didn't come here and show everybody some figure ground pictures. So the point of this slide is really to start having people think about how the spaces we either intentionally or unintentionally, right? Because inaction is also action. How do the spaces that we create influence the way we live and work? So on this slide, you can see the cities that are listed there. Who here has been to one of these cities? Okay, great. And then who here has been to two of them? Okay, so if you could sit there for a moment, you can even close your eyes. Imagine being on the ground in one of those cities. Imagine the noises you might hear, the scale of the buildings, what it feels like, what is the width of the roadways, maybe also some of the, the flow, the energy, the hum of the city. How does that feel to you? How easy was it for you to find your way the first time you went there? Or how hard, right? So the interesting thing about this is looking at figure grounds, you can kind of start to get a sense of, how these cities are different. In terms of their scale and their design. But for me, the most compelling thing is looking at these and then connecting them back to that feeling, that experience of actually being there, and what that is like. So this is another area where, as we start to plan out, what a future community might look like in space on a celestial surface, we definitely need to be thinking about how every drawing, every design, people are going to be living and working there. People will either thrive or they won't because of what we put there. So I bring this up because who here loves this picture and is inspired by it? All right, I am. Okay, so the interesting thing about this is that this image really captures the imagination, which is what I love about it. And it's exciting, and it makes me think of a future where we have tons of celestial citizens out there living and working on the Martian surface, hopefully all thriving. But when you actually start to look at this image, right, you see that there maybe wasn't as much intentionality in the design. And not to pick on SpaceX, I think that they weren't intending to do that with this artwork here. But it's just to make the point that when you start looking at it, you go, okay, well, what's the distance of those launch pads? What's a safe distance that we can put them away? I heard somebody yesterday mention how there would be a difference in height between the launch site and where people's habitats would be, which I thought was interesting. But it just brings up the point that there's safety concerns, there might be different land uses that we want to protect for different things. How did we choose this site? How did we prep the site? How did we prepare it and know that it was safe to build in that particular site? And then all of those buildings, right? What are their functions? It looks like there might be some kind of a grid pattern going on there, but otherwise it seems like a random assortment of buildings. So how does maybe someone who works in a greenhouse, how far do they have to travel to get to where they live? How easy is it for them to transport to another part of that community? What is the time spent doing that? Do they feel like it's efficient? Are they waiting, forever to get where they want to go? So all of these different things start at the heart of figuring out how will humans actually experience what you see here before you. And the only way to figure that out, in my opinion, is to start thinking about examples of what we've already done, of course, but also extracting what we've learned from other cities and communities and then leveraging that for space. So here again, right, we see on the left-hand side, we see Barcelona, which obviously has a very specific urban design to it. And then we see McMurdo Station, right? Where do you want to spend your time? And I guess weather also would be an influence there. But with McMurdo Station, I look at that and I go, well, that's just a hodgepodge of buildings. There's nothing really exciting about that. There's nothing that makes me want to go and visit just for that reason. Now, maybe the science, maybe the research I might do, that would be a driving force. But I think for all of us, as we think about living, on the moon or Mars, we really want to be encouraging people to want to go. This has to be an amazing human experience. We might not get everything right from the get-go, but we can at least try to be very thoughtful in the process. One of the key ingredients for that is public participation. So we need to start thinking about how we actually bring forward feedback from the public, what their concerns are, what their hopes are, and start to integrate that into governmental and corporate decision-making. And really, there's a lot of reasons to do this. It's consensus building, it's also minimizing cost overruns and delays, it's community building, it's also just generally good for creating a non-adversarial environment and a civil society. So at Celestial Citizen, really, this is our multi-channel approach of how we aim to do that, right? And so I won't speak to necessarily everything on here, but I will say that we like to find a balance of meeting people where they are. So approaching things from thick and thin participation methods, thick being the type that require a lot of your participants. They have to really be engaged. Yesterday, maybe some of you were at our workshop, and people were engaged. They were talking, and it required a lot of them. They had to really sit down and think for 90 minutes about, in that particular conversation, analog habitat planning. But we could be doing more and more of these community workshops and these collective visioning exercises. We can also be reaching people, much like we already are, on our social media. We can reach them through polls and surveys, things that take a little less time. But we should be thinking about many different innovative tools that, frankly, come from the urban planning community and how to integrate those. So a little bit more about our platform of how we are currently reaching our audience, which is, I'm very happy to say, a very global audience and over 100,000 strong at this point. But it's through podcasts, it's through our newsletter, it's through short films, it's through building, again, that virtual community that we have. On the last slide, I'll have a QR code if you want to join our community and enter into the chat on Substack that we have. And it's also doing more workshops. So in summary, why space urban planning? Hopefully, if I haven't convinced you already, then hopefully this last slide sums it up. But really, the key features of space urban planning all boil down to we need a plan. And I'm going to go ahead and say that we need a comprehensive plan. I know it's very common to talk about it in terms of master planning, and I think that's missing the point. Master planning, in my mind, suggests one starchitect or one urban planner that sits pencil down and thinks about what this future looks like. That's not a future I'm interested in. What I'm interested is in what all of you think, what everyone listening thinks, the people we haven't even connected with yet, what they think. And it's about integrating all that feedback into a collective community vision. We live in an amazing time of technology where this is more and more possible every day. We need to be leveraging that. And so the key features are public participation, innovative policy making, but also those cross-industry initiatives that I mentioned before. Systems thinking, tech integration, having companies that are working on interesting tech also wanting to connect with the public to create better designs. And also, again, most importantly, that community-driven visioning helps build consensus and it helps develop norms that help us all in space. That's the QR code. Please join the conversation by becoming and it's totally free, but you can become a subscriber to us on Substack. You'll get access to our newsletter. You can also chat directly with me and anyone else in our community there as well. Thank you so much for your time, and if anyone has any questions, you can come on up. Thank you. Yes?
Are there already people who are thinking about that, like the next Frank Lloyd Wright on Mars? Do you have folks who are identified, or are you still very much in the early stages of we're not there yet?
Oh, no. I mean, the space architecture community, and that's a great question, is very robust. And so actually I see that as sort of a precursor to what I hope the space urban planning community will become. So, there are actually one of my professors from when I was in grad school, Madhu Tongavelu, and some others, Melody Ashar, who was actually just here yesterday and co-hosting the workshop, Phenom Bagley, tons of people, I can't even mention all of them. We've interviewed a lot of them on Celestial Citizen podcast, but there is a robust space architecture community that are all creating amazing designs. So I encourage you to check that out. And like I said, hopefully the urban planning community won't be far behind.
Everybody, a big round of applause for Britt Duffy Atkins. Thank you so much.